Welcome. I'm Deborah Ann Clement, and thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Shortcut to the Soul. So today I have a guest joining me, and before I bring him on, let me tell you a little bit about him. So to start with, his name is Anthony Picco, and he's been a professional astrologer since 1986. Now, Anthony considers himself to be a to-the-point astrologer. He relies on traditional, tried and true basics, and it has certainly served him well because he has done hundreds, probably thousands, of readings and has countless hours of client counseling under his belt. Now, he's been a guest on many other internet radio shows and some terrestrial radio, some cable TV also, but he's the host of his own internet radio show, and the name is Cosmic Tuesdays. Now, it happens to air every Monday evening from 9:30 to 11 p.m. Eastern Time. And in this show, Anthony interviews guests from a very wide range of spiritual and metaphysical practices. So you get astrologers, psychics, NDE survivors, feng shui experts, and on and on. And check out his show by all means. All of the links are going to be posted on my blog page and in these notes, but it is www.spreaker.com/show/Cosmic-Tuesdays. But again, you can get the link, right in the notes. And once a month, Anthony is the host and facilitator of the New York City Astrology Meetup group. Now, that's usually held on either the second Tuesday or the second Thursday of the month at the Quest bookstore in New York City. So if you are in the area, by all means, drop in. And he does an opening astro chat for the beginners. And then there's a speaker every month. So if you want, register for the announcements. Join the group. Just go to meetup.com and join the New York Astrology Meetup. Now, he's more than just a host because he is also a speaker, and he's lectured extensively, not just on astrology, but he's also been a scholar on the Seth materials since 1982, and he has hosted many Seth discussion groups over the years. And so now with that, it's my pleasure to bring Anthony on. So welcome to the show.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to do this show. Really.
Good. It's always fun doing these shows because I learn, both the guest and the interviewer learn stuff as they go along. So it's always enjoyable.
It is. And the Seth, and I just mentioned the Seth material because long before Abraham Hicks, there was Seth. And I really think if a lot of my listeners may not have ever heard of Seth, especially the younger ones. And so for me personally, I just want to say I remember when Seth Speaks, when the book came out. And I was pretty young. And at that point, to be honest, my focus wasn't on spirituality. My focus was on boys. Okay. It was like, yeah. And so I just knew there was this Seth thing out there that people were talking about that was kind of controversial, to be honest, at the time. And I only really discovered Seth that I sat down and started reading the books, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. And once I started it, I was like, oh my God, besides how far ahead of the time, when I think of the time that this book came out, but what just a fabulous resources. So I'm thrilled to have you on with your expertise. And so I'm just going to ask you, how did you discover Seth?
Well, first I ran away from it. In 1976, the first Seth Speaks book, the one entitled Seth Speaks, The Eternal Validity of the Soul, was published in 1972. And in 76, somebody showed me a copy of it and said, hey, you should check this out. And it was the original purple cover of Seth Speaks. I turned it over, and there was the author, and they had these concentric circles coming out of her face. And I thought, okay, weirdo, no, goodbye. Thank you very much. Then what happened about 6 years later in 1982, I was dating somebody who had both the first two books in her apartment, and she was like, oh, yeah, I've read them, and she seemed very casual about it, so I picked them up and started reading them. Now, in the 6 intervening years, I had taken Silva Mind Control. I had studied a lot of Alan Watts stuff and Zen stuff. I didn't, I wasn't a Buddhist or anything, but Seth just took it the rest of the way. Kind of to a certain degree, a lot of philosophy and spiritual beliefs will get you up to the point like both death and what the limits seem to be. And then Seth took us so much further that I read the Seth books like a man in the desert with a cup of water. It was just like, give me this. This makes perfect sense. And I burned through them. I just grabbed all the copies that were out there. Just a real quick run through. Seth Speaks is the first dictated book by Seth. I'll explain that a little bit later.
Good.
The next is The Nature of Personal Reality in 74. The Unknown Reality, volumes 1 and 2, were published in 77 and 79. The Nature of the Psyche is 1979 also. My favorite book, The Individual and the Nature of Mass Events, which also appeals to Capricorns. We'll get into that too. 1981. And then after Jane Roberts died in 84, Dreams, Evolutions, and Value Fulfillment came out in 2 volumes in 86. The Magical Approach, 95. The Way Toward Health, 97. And they have since been publishing the private sessions that were not book dictations. The early sessions, the personal sessions, and the early class sessions, which are all being released privately. There's like 10 volumes or more of this stuff. So I got into it, like I said, like a fish into water. Basically, you strip Seth down to you create your own reality on every level whatsoever. There are no accidents. You have chosen everything that happens to you. And, of course, immediately you have people, understandably, jump in and say, well, what about I got mugged last week? What about the Holocaust? What about this? What about that? And we did create these things both together and separately. And because we survive death, we survive birth.
Right.
We exist before birth. We exist after death. So in many ways, a lot of the Zen stuff is like, oh, life is an illusion. And it's true, except it's a very important illusion that we chose to have and work with and learn from. So just saying it's an illusion doesn't mean it's meaningless. And we have to be here to believe certain things, to work certain things through. If you thought this was just a rehearsal, how seriously would you take it?
That's true.
As a matter of fact, it's funny. I've been an art director, and I had an assistant, and he knew I was into mystical stuff. And I was kind of depressed one week, and he said, "Well, what about this, Tony? Come on." And I'm like, "Oh, I'll get it right in my next life." And he turned to me and he said, "But this is the only time you'll be Tony Picco." And it really threw me for a loop. It's like, it's true. We come in with every life with specific agendas and plans. It's not locked in stone. Nothing is locked in stone. That, to me, is the wonderful thing about the Seth material. Everything's up to us. Nothing happened to us accidentally, which means we can change it. One of my favorite Seth quotes, which I can see if I can find it here in front of me, he said, here it is, "Suffering is not good for the soul unless it teaches you how to stop suffering. That is its purpose." Okay?
And how profound is that?
I know. And how often as an astrologer we look at people's charts, we look at their strengths, and we look at their challenges, and we try to suggest to them how to work through the challenges to make them function better. Yeah. Which is what I do as an astrologer. And Seth ties in really perfectly with that. Just a little historical background.
Sure.
Seth stuff, how Jane Roberts started channeling Seth. In the early 60s, 1963, she was a freelance writer, and she got a contract to write a book. And the concept of the book was that for each chapter, she would approach some spiritual psychic discipline as a novice and try it out, and then write a chapter in each thing. So it'd be like maybe one chapter in tarot cards, one chapter in Ouija boards, one chapter in seeing a psychic, whatever it might be. And she was an avowed atheist at the time, and probably still is wherever she is. Well, what happened is they started working with the Ouija board, and she said she started anticipating what the board was going to spell out in her head. And then after several sessions with the Ouija board, she stopped using the Ouija board, and she stood up and just started speaking for Seth. And her husband was very detail-oriented. He's the one that took all the notes. He did over 1,000 sessions together.
Yeah.
And what happened was the first book published was called The Seth Material, which was actually she wrote the book, and a lot of the book is excerpts from the sessions that they had with Seth. And then in the late 60s, Seth decided, I'm going to write my own book.
Mm-hmm.
And he refers to himself I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he says, they said, who are you? And they said, I am an energy entity currently not in a physical body. Okay? And not only did he write the books, he dictated punctuation, chapter headings, the whole deal. And one of the things that impressed him is they might stop in the middle of a paragraph and they might not resume for a month, and he would just pick it up right away where he left off. So it's incredibly rich material. I find, I don't want to call it dense because it sounds like it's impenetrable. Anyway, it's not that dense, but it's thick with. You can read the same page 5 times and discover 5 additional things every time you read it. It's so well written and framed and put together. It reads, for me, and I'm not knocking other channeled entities.
But go ahead.
A lot of times they come through with kind of a stilted accent and inside-out sentences and stuff for whatever reason. Seth is so clearly written, it's stunning. It's like the sentences make sense. There's no problem following what he's talking about. Other than, of course, your mind gets blown every now and then, so you have to stop and go, wait a minute, whoa, I can't follow that. But not because it's not well written. It's just because your head is freaking out,
I had to reread. I mean, when I was reading the book, there were several pages or several paragraphs that I would read it, and I would say, okay, I have to read this again. I have to read this again. And if you go back and reread the book, because I've read it more than once, you get something more from it every single time. And again, on the same page as you, not to be meaning no disrespect, to anyone else out there. It's just some of the channeled information in the recent years. It's very, I don't want to call this like, to me, it's the equivalent in many ways of what I would say, newspaper sun sign kind of astrology, as opposed to really having a reading and having your chart done.
Right.
There's just much more depth with Seth.
Yes, and it's the basic thing is you create your own reality. But part of what the important thing I find about his teachings is he explains to us that our beliefs create reality. What you expect is what you get. As a matter of fact, one of the quotes is, "You get what you concentrate upon. There is no other rule." So I mention this because he's not advocating a Pollyanna-like optimism. Okay, everything's going to be wonderful. But what he is encouraging is a sense of faith. Like if something happens and you're upset by it, you sit there and you say, there is a way out. I haven't figured it out yet. I will find it. And that's that sense of faith, the belief that there is a solution. I'm not condemned to do this. Options will be available. I haven't discovered them yet. And it keeps you moving forward. Our beliefs, and he says we're born trusting. We're born kind of aware of our connection with the universe. And, of course, we get talked out of it growing up, and this is a real simplistic way of putting it, but I'm just using it as an example. Maybe when you grew up, your mother was always beating your father and humiliating him. And so you grow up believing that's what relationships are because that's you're grounding it. And you don't realize it's baggage. It's a belief you have, and you think it's a fact because that's what you've experienced, And we hold on to our beliefs, and we resist so hard because a friend of mine put this to me. He says people would rather be right than happy, and it's like so we'd rather reinforce the beliefs we have than actually take a risk and find a way out of that trap. Which to me is part of what Saturn symbolizes in the chart, the patterns we create for ourselves, in our astrology charts, or the baggage we carry with us that structures our lives. You grow up with alcoholic parents and you believe you can't trust authority. That's not necessarily true. So these are the beliefs that kind of keep us going. And
And because you sent me a quote, and I'm just going to read it, and it is from actually The Individual and the Nature of Mass Events, session 833, page 163. And it says, if you believe in the sinfulness of the world, for instance, then you'll search out from normal sense data those facts that confirm your belief. But beyond that, at other levels, you also organize your mental world in such a way that attracts to yourself events that again will confirm your beliefs. And what I was going to say is, we've heard this like in the past 20, 30, 40 years, certainly in the 80s. And again, with this Louise Hay, Shakti Gawain, we had these other New Age leaders that I'm just going to say they're much more well known. All right. Among people today, and even the younger people, they're just more, I don't say household names, but let's say they've been on Oprah, whatever the reason might be, but they're known. And just as this point that Seth was the first.
Also part
in this,
of it,
right? In this particular thought.
I mean, he's certainly somebody that tied it all together, because actually if you go back through history,
right,
read between the lines of so much stuff.
Yes.
Even the Bible says, ask and it'll be given it to you, knock and it'll be open to you.
It's there.
It's there. He ties it together,
Yeah. I guess it was this first, a book that was sort of, it was out in the public, because by this point in time, right, our media was so much more than years ago when you had little books and writings about it, but people didn't have the access to it.
Yes, and one of the reasons I think Seth is not as well known is that Jane Roberts really resisted the material, which is fascinating in its own right, because she was anti-God, anti-guru, anti-spiritual leader. She didn't she didn't want people coming to her asking how to live their lives, and so they did a few radio shows in the early years, and then just stopped. They just wrote books, and that was it. And the funny thing, Seth has actually came through and said that it took a while to get to certain topics because he could not channel through her on certain things that she refused to accept. Yeah. So this was a collaborative effort. As a matter of fact, Seth even said the husband, Robert Butch, Jane Roberts, and Seth are all kind of this triumvirate that needed each other to create this material. Okay? And just to fry with everybody's head.
Go for it.
At one point, Seth said, and you'll have to interpret this the way you want to, Jane, the current Jane that wrote the books or channeled the books, he said that Jane was doing a much better job of being Jane than when he was Jane.
Yes.
Okay? Chew on that and deal with it any way you like. I kind of understand it when I don't think about it. I start thinking about it, and it's like, wait a minute, But he also, I'm going to just throw some things out there. He talks about probable realities. And he says when we make decisions, we kind of split. Just a quick example, there's a Tony that became an astrologer, and there's a Tony that didn't become an astrologer. And that, for me, the astrologer, Tony who isn't an astrologer is a probable reality. But that exists. And in that probable reality, the Tony that's not an astrologer considers me a probability. So we actually manifest outwards in this kind of blossoming, taking every road traveled. The road less traveled, we took them all. It's just that one of them is the one we focus on.
And time does not exist. So all of our past and present lives are all happening now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they influence each other. That's an important thing to realize, is that decisions you make in this life will ripple into all of your other lives because they're happening now. As a matter of fact, Jane Roberts, I listed the Seth books, but Jane has written a couple of novels called the
Oversoul?
The Education of Oversoul 7,
yes,
where she tried to put in fictional context an example of how she understood Seth's concepts. And so different people in different time periods are making choices and affecting each other across the time periods. So, yes, it's and one of the things I also like that he said is that you are, how do I explain this? The oak tree, the future oak tree calls to the acorn to become the oak tree. Your future self is calling you to come forward. And it's not just like I'm growing up to that. On the other side, it's pulling you towards it. So
you already are that.
Yes, I'm somewhere you already are that,
Yes.
and you aim in that direction as a result. Now, all of this is very flexible, and one of the early Seth Speaks sessions is, in other words, you should be as flexible mentally, psychologically, and spiritually as possible, open to new ideas, creative, and not overly dependent upon organizations or dogma.
Yeah.
And he has even said he did not want to be a guru. He does not want to be worshipped. And he said, anything you hear me say that you don't agree with, then don't listen to it. Trust your own self, and your own beliefs and your own feelings, once you get in touch with them, of course. Because that's the question he always asks. You have to ask yourself, why do you believe what you believe? And get to the core of why you do. Like I said, maybe you realize, oh, wait, my mother always beat up my dad, so that's why I believe women are supposed to beat up men in relationships. And then you can go from there. You can suddenly realize, oh, this is a little trap I set up for myself. I don't have to live in this trap anymore.
It's an illusion. It really isn't real.
Yes.
It's a belief, right? It's this belief, and some people could say, oh, it's conditioning, but it's what we, years ago, remember there was that poem, what is it? Children live what they learn.
Yes.
Right. And so, a perfect example. But I do want to go back to the oversoul and, the concurrent lifetimes, because that was something that when I first was exposed to it, I really thought like, what the heck? I mean, I had a hard time at first wrapping my head around that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course.
Especially being a Capricorn, right? And you're a Capricorn, so,
yes.
You can kind of get that. And I'm like, wait a minute. And I get it. I mean, now I get it. I'm completely on board with it. But it was something where at first, when the idea was to me, and I figured, I'm open-minded and all this, but I still had a hard time sort of grasping it. And so that's one of the things when I think back to the time, the 70s, even the 80s, when this information was coming out. And you think about what the world was and the limited state of minds. I mean, it's so much more open today, right? There's so much more out there. But
yes.
Back then, it was sort of like shocking material. And it was kind of like, what is this? I remember someone, this is when I was young, and the little bit I heard about Seth, but I remember someone saying like, what is it with that freak show? And that, it was like, and I remember it was like, this person on drugs writing this, what's going on? But Jane, she was an atheist, and she was rather, I don't want to say that she was cynical, because I don't mean that like in a bad way, but she questioned things, she wasn't just like, oh, this is coming through, and yes, this is, she questioned, is it real?
And as a result, I think it makes the Seth books more grounded, because she didn't just go, oh yes, let's run off into the
I'm
field.
A channel.
Yes. She for a long time she was thinking it was her subconscious doing this.
Yes.
But then after a while she had to say, but whatever I'm saying is interesting. Yeah. So she began to look at it and realize it, but it took her a long time, I think, to accept that she was channeling an entity. And actually, her big resistance, the first bunch of books were about how people could change their lives. But then when she got to the individual and the nature of mass events, Seth now took it out into the world and showed how all of us create society together. And she really fought this, I think, on some level. This is actually when her health started to deteriorate.
Yeah.
Seth has brought up stuff. Not only do we all create our own reality, but we together create reality as mass events. Like, as an example, Superstorm Sandy is something we all chose to create together, and then we all chose how to be engaged by it. Are we going to be a victim? Are we going to be a rescuer? Are we going to be donating money? Are we going to be the part of the, the engineers trying to find ways to prevent it from happening? So we agree to these mass events specifically to move us along in society because something's called for. One simplistic example is there was at one point Elmira, New York, which is where they lived, the Roberts and
yes.
Jane Roberts and her. There was a flood, and the flood came up to the first floor of their house, and they were okay. But Seth suggested that sometimes disasters happen because we need to be brought back together. we need to be pulled together and realize we are connected to each other, and we shouldn't be ignoring each other. Now, that's one simplistic answer. Seth always says there's multiple levels of why things happen. So if I say a black and white answer, it's just because I'm just merely a three-dimensional being trying to make sense of what he's talking about. And he's even said when we dream, we become multidimensional. We just come back into our bodies when we wake up. Go ahead.
But on that collective level, I'm just going to, because there's sort of a collective consciousness, so to speak. We create these events, and sometimes we create them as a catalyst.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely. And he even says that on a, I hate to use the word higher because it implies superior in some way, right. But on a different awareness level, if you want to call it your oversoul or your higher self, we know all of this is an illusion. So sometimes some of us come in specifically to die to make a statement.
Yeah.
Okay. So if there's perhaps a massacre somewhere and we're not paying attention to how we take care of ourselves, there are people who, on some level of speaking, volunteer to die in this horrible incident and then make a statement to the world, and then the world responds, like the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages. One of the things he talked about is that the wealthy and the royalty and everything were being more and more and more separated from the poor. And, well, here comes the bubonic plague. Nobody's getting away with this, and you're drawn back together again. And again, that's one simplified comment for it. There's probably many things going on that I'm not multidimensional enough to understand.
Right.
But and that's kind of the stuff that happens. These big huge events, Hurricane Katrina, whatever you want to call them, are there to make statements. And when you look at them, Hurricane Katrina suddenly became, well, what about the poor? Why are we not taking care of them? Why are we not having disaster response? What's really going on here? All these things get addressed when we have these huge mass events. He even says that weather is actually emotional. Weather is responding to our emotions, which, not to go off on a tangent.
Right, but
climate change.
Right. Go ahead.
Clearly there's something going on where we're all kind of confused right now, and we've lost a lot of patterns that we used to have. And this is my interpretation. I mean, Seth, there hasn't been a Seth book since 1984 when Jane passed. But my interpretation is clearly the old ways aren't working anymore. And I think it makes a big statement about us as a planet in general, that we need to address what's going on, and we need to make sense out of this and work with it. So I understand what he talks about when he says the individual nature of mass events. It's the mass events bring us together, and we create stuff together as a group, not just as an individual, because we choose whether to get involved or not. So it's he even let me see how I put this. He talks about you need to let yourself feel what you're feeling and acknowledge it. And he says one example is that you should follow your impulses, on a personal level, which is always kind of frightening.
Yes.
We've been taught our impulses are bad. And what taught us was logic. I'm going to get into split brains and intuition in a minute, and he said, if you listen to your impulses, you'll find the answers. And people are very quick to say, well, I wanted to kill somebody the other day,
Right.
And Seth tells this wonderful story of how, as a quickie example, the boss comes in and finds you sleeping at your desk, and he's very polite to you. He shakes you awake and says, you must be tired, but come on, wake up, don't sleep on the job, it looks bad, whatever, you're not getting the work done. And really, he's maybe kind of mad when he does it, but he doesn't express it. And then the fourth or fifth time he wakes this guy up for falling asleep 4 times in a row, he's ready to kill him. But that's because he denied the first 3 times he felt something. Maybe the first time, if he just turned to the person and said, hey, I'm really, really upset at this. This is bothering me. And just an extension from that, Seth has said that hate will lead you back to love if you examine it. And in this particular metaphor of the guy, waking up the first time he comes in and discovers him, he's really mad. Why? I gave you this job. We work well together. I trusted you. I relied on you. And the reason he's mad and full of hate is because he's hurt. Yeah. He's emotionally hurt. And then he goes back. He has to go back to the fact that he wasn't loved properly. Hate will lead you back to love if you examine what's going on there. The same way suffering is a way of learning how not to suffer. Hate can bring you back to love if you're open to what you're feeling and what you're going through.
And you don't get stuck there.
And you don't get stuck. Yeah. Part of the, although there's been some disapproval of this, I'm going to use the metaphors of left brain and right brain just because it's convenient. The left brain is your logical brain, 1 + 1 = 2, and the logical brain does your taxes, And the intuitive brain is much more free associative. Like a lot of people, what's that book, Drawing in the Right Side of the Brain, is teaching how if you get around your logic, you can be very creative. And Seth has suggested that the intuitive brain is supposed to be in charge, and we've flipped that. He said the intuitive brain knows what's going to happen before it happens. The logical brain doesn't. So the logical brain is afraid all the time because it doesn't know what's going to happen next, and it starts making rules. Well, if we do this and this and this, we want it to be afraid. We have to, and it looks to prevent things. And one of the quotes I have from The Individual Nature of Mass Events, the idea of prevention is always based upon fear, because you do not want to prevent something that is joyful. Often, therefore, preventative medicine causes what it hopes to avoid. Not only does the idea of prevention continually promote the entire system of fear, but specific steps taken to prevent a disease in a body not already stricken, again, often sets up reactions that bring about side effects that would occur if the disease had in fact simply been suffered and gone through, and that's a tough one. Fear, I always say fear is the opposite of love, because love is a sense of faith and trust, and the opposite of that is fear, not hate, but fear, and it's, look at what goes on around us politically. Everybody's trying to make us afraid of something to control us and make us behave a certain way.
Historically, right? Show me, and I don't care what government it is, right? You rule through fear. And quite frankly, when you think back, parents, parenting, and I'm not knocking it, but I can think back when I was younger, it's like you have to behave or you would fear the consequences. Right. It's always about, and yet we're capable of so much more. One of my favorite examples from The Individual and Nature of Mass Events is towards the end of the book, he talks about how for years and years and years, it was believed that nobody could break the 5-minute mile. That's right. You can't run faster than 5 miles a minute or 5 minutes a mile. I don't remember, And what happened is at some point in the 60s, somebody broke it. And then within the next few years, 3 or 4 more people broke that record. That's right. Because we all believed for a long time you cannot break the 5-minute mile. And then somebody came along and said, look at that. And the limit was taken away. The limit was taken away. The door was opened. And the funny thing is, one of the people in one of my Seth groups was a track coach. And not only did the guy break the 5-minute mile, but he said the guy who did it, and I can't explain the details because I'm not an athlete, but he said the guy did things that were counterintuitive to the way people believed you could run faster. Yeah. So he listened to himself and said, I'm going to break the 5-minute mile, and he did. And then he opened the door for everybody else. And he said, we're quite capable of doing more than we currently can, but our beliefs hold us back. Oh, I can't handle that. Oh, that's too much for any human to do. Whatever it might be, we cripple ourselves. We don't accept what we can do. Well, I was going to say, it reminds me of a quote, especially by Albert Einstein, who said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. And he's certainly somebody that did both, to be creative and create the, E equals MC squared, which is actually something I find very spiritual because, Seth says everything is connected. Everything has consciousness. The entire universe has consciousness. Your chair is aware if it's a chair. Your table is aware it's a table. Cats, blankets, windows, whatever, cars, whatever. Everything has plants. Awareness. Everything has awareness, and it's all connected, and it's all part of one entity. He refers to it
all that is, capital A, capital T, capital I, all that is. And yet all of us are individuals and separate in our own way. I often liken it to cells in your body. Like I'm Tony Picco, but I have fat cells and muscle cells and nerve cells and brain cells, and they eat and they dump and they reproduce and they die, and I'm still here. I think I'm not sure the exact number, but I think every 7 years all the cells in your body are replaced. So the question becomes, then who are you? You're an energy matrix holding it together in some way, shape, or form. The same way that all that is all of us, and yet also has its own consciousness, is kind of aware of what's going on around itself all the time. And I bring it back to Einstein, because what E equals MC squared basically says is that mass is energy in a different form. Right. Which means everything is energy. And if you're a Reiki master, if you're an energy healer, if you're doing any of this stuff, you've kind of learned everything is energy. It just has to be directed, which is kind of what Seth talked about and Jesus talked about. But because Reiki is actually Reiki healing was created by a Japanese monk who his students asked him, how did Jesus heal people? And he went up the mountain and meditated for 25 days or
something like that, right?
And then bing, he got it, and he came down and he explained about Reiki and energy manipulation. So it's all energy, and we're energy too, and it's not that hard. I mean, telepathy makes sense if everything's connected. My foot knows what my hand is doing. Well, why wouldn't we be able to tune into each other, and realize what's going on?
Seth, also something that was really interesting that I just want to mention. It was
Sure.
One of the quotes that you shared with me, and when it talks about death, and Seth says, it should be noted before we begin that death itself is a deliverer of your species and all others. It is not negative in itself, but instead is the beginning of a different kind of positive experience. It prunes the planet, so to speak, so there's room and time for all, energy and food for all. If death had disappeared even an hour, all of life would soon be threatened.
Yes. And we all worry about dying,
Yeah.
And yet Seth has also said that no one dies before they are ready to die.
I believe that. I believe that.
And I have, an example from my life is I have two different examples. One, a friend of mine, a guy called DJ, was in the military, and he was doing parachuting exercises, and the guy who jumped after him jumped too soon and landed in his parachute, and they basically fell to the ground from the airplane. They landed by going through some trees, and they hit the ground. They both lived, and it did take him a year of physical therapy to get back in shape. And he used to joke that he can tell what weather is going to happen a year before it happens because of his bones and breaks.
Right.
But he lived. And meanwhile, when I was in high school, my brother's girlfriend's brother, who was 16 or something, tripped, fell, hit his head, got up, said, oh, that was painful, went to bed and died.
Yeah.
We die when we're ready to die, and we do not die before we're ready to die. And that's something, but that, now you get into that ugly thing of what about a victim of crime?
Right.
And they have chosen that for whatever reason, because the higher self knows this isn't the only game in town, and that we're here to teach or learn something. Actually, one of my favorite stories he told, and I have to kind of paraphrase it here and simplify it, but a couple came to Jane Roberts' early days saying that our child died, and we were he was 8 or 10, and they were both devastated. The wife in particular was completely destroyed by it, and they were looking for answers. And again, I have to simplify it because Seth needs to simplify it for us. But he said that the three of them had incarnated together before. I have to use time terms, but
Right.
And they were all planning on coming back in, but the couple had begun to get off the path, so to speak, get off the lessons, losing track of their agenda, however you want to define it. So the son came in specifically to die at 8 or 9 years old, to throw them for a loop and make them ask questions. Okay. And he did. He lived. The wife unfortunately did not, and ended up dying a few years later herself. But when you look at it that way, it's kind of like, so he came in to shake them up, and he did, and he even said the guy did the person that came in to die young specifically wanted to die before puberty because he didn't want to get caught up in the boy girl sex and all that stuff. He's, let me get out of here before I get really committed, and made his statement. So it doesn't mean it's not tragic. And I want to say when somebody says, "Oh, you chose to be mugged and killed," that doesn't forgive the mugger for doing what they did. They still chose to do something. They chose to be part of this, and it's not cool. It's got to be dealt with. That's one of the reasons we do these things. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form, and this is sometimes a problem I find with some Seth studiers, that it doesn't mean everything's okay and everything's permissible. There is a moral understanding of things, and the one basic rule is like you don't have any right to take someone's life, is an important part of the Seth material. So it's not, I'm not saying just because you got mugged in something, it's like, oh, you must have wanted to be mugged. It's like, well, yeah, but that doesn't forgive the mugger. The mugger then has to ask, well, why do you feel the need to mug people?
Right.
What is this about you that you think is something that's important to create? And, is actually, talking about evil, this is a quote of his from one of the classes he gave. As long as you believe in the basic evil of man, then you must project upon yourself great punishment. You must see your world destroyed, and so you will have prophets to tell you so, and so will they speak the truth, for they will speak from your own beliefs and the idea of your own evil. But I tell you, you are full of grace. Your planet is full of grace. When you understand that, you will not need to pretend to destroy yourself or your planet. You can live lovingly with yourself and with your planet. So it's our beliefs. We're bad people. Oh, Armageddon is, how many at the end of the world is
oh my God.
We're all bad people, and the end of the world is coming, Again, this is all fear-based, and this belief that, like, we're bad somehow. But he has also said we're not that self-destructive. If we were self-destructive as we thought we were, we wouldn't have gotten past, like, ancient Egypt.
No. We wouldn't be here.
Yeah. And we have so many religions that tell us we're garbage, or that we're sacred, but not right now. Later on, you'll be sacred. Right now, you're a piece of garbage.
You have to do a lot of work.
Yes.
You're not even close.
And I'm sorry, that's just hogwash to me. But one of my favorite Seth quotes: "The universe leans in your direction." And what he means by that is that the universe wants to cooperate with you. The universe, or all that is, wants to bring about what you want to bring about.
Well, the universe is always cooperating, and right, it is always bringing about where our attention is and what our beliefs are.
Right.
It's what we're feeding it.
Yes, and one of my favorite quotes too, and this can be misunderstood: if it isn't fun, stop doing it. Which, of course, immediately people go like, "What? I shouldn't pay my taxes? What about raising my kids?" That's not what it's about.
No.
It's like, if you're not enjoying what you're doing, stop doing it. Find out why you're not enjoying it. Quit your job. Find a new job. You're unhappy in your marriage. Responsibly leave your marriage. Don't just run out the door. But an element of fun is always important. An element of play. He even says that anything done in absolute seriousness will not happen. There has to be a sense of play about it. In a way of speaking, all that is wants to see what we're going to come up with. All that is created all of us to, like, imbue us with creativity, and wants to see something interesting, wants to see something challenging, wants to say, like, wow, I didn't think of that. Wow, I didn't think of that either, and wants us to be creative, and we're creative all the time. We're not just talking about doing a painting or music. The way you structure your job is creative. The way you deal with your employees or deal with your boss is creative. The way everything we do in life is creative. The rules are there sometimes as guidelines, but creativity is what matters and is much more important. One of the quotes is the nature of personal reality: "Your spirit joined itself with flesh, and in flesh, to experience a world of incredible richness, to create a dimension of reality of colors and form. Your spirit was born in flesh to enrich a marvelous area of sense awareness, to feel energy made into corporeal form. You are here to use, enjoy, and express yourself through your body. You are here to aid in the great expansion of consciousness. You are not here to cry about the miseries of the human condition, but to change them when you find them not to your liking through the joy, strength, and vitality that is within you. To create the spirit as faithfully and beautifully as you can in flesh.
See, I believe we all come here on purpose, with a purpose. And when we see things and you read things, and for example, you're miserable in your job, right? You're absolutely miserable in your job. And by all means, and when we say, get a new job, find something that you love, it doesn't necessarily mean just go in and quit tomorrow and don't worry about paying your rent or your mortgage. But it's really about taking, and I'm going to call it right action. And I mean like right action for you, for the individual. But that's, what it is. Because even I'm going to say astrologically, when I meet with clients and we're looking sometimes at the cycles, right, and the transits, and something major is coming up. And I always say this to my clients. Yes, is the influence, but a big part of it is, what have you been doing up until now?
Yes, absolutely.
And it's that, I'm going to say the personal responsibility. But, I do want to talk for one thing about Seth, because he talks quite a bit about health.
Yes, he does. Actually, I gave a whole lecture on health once about Seth and health. What particular direction would you like to go? Well,
the thing about that I remember him talking about, I'm reading it also from one of the quotes, so I don't remember which one it was, is because he also talks about how, like, as the individual, we feel powerless at the mercy, of doctors and nurses. And that actually stuck with me, because one of the things when I look back over the years, like when I was growing up, and I'm sure when you were growing up, doctors were gods. Okay, at least when I was growing up, it's like the doctor said something and you did not question it. And fortunately, the generation, especially the Pluto and Virgo generation, came to age and said, hey, you know what? Doctors are not gods. We need second opinions. We need, there's alternative health and all, we went into different directions. But he does talk about the powerlessness we were feeling because of doctors and nurses. And of course, the actual physical illness, the stages of illness in our body, and the part that we play in it.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I have a couple of great quotes on that. From the early sessions, the question is, what is health? And he said, the jump from a local condition to a statement like, I am a mess, should be avoided. An inclination to project a local symptom on the body in general is very poor and takes focus away from very definite advances which go unnoticed. When the knee is bad today, for example, the tendency is to focus upon it and the difficulties involved, and to ignore entirely the other portions of the body which are not affected. Then in the overall, he sees himself in these terms, generally, I'm a mess. The attitude should be, this area is affected, why? We can find out. Okay, and in reference to the medical community, and again, I think doctors are useful. I'm not in any way putting medicine down.
No.
But he says, unfortunately, and this is from the individual in the Nature of Mass Events, unfortunately, many of your public health programs and commercial statements through the various media provide you with mass meditations of the most deplorable kind. I refer to those in which the specific symptoms of various diseases are given, in which the individual is further told to examine the body with those symptoms in mind. I also refer to those statements that are just as unfortunately specified diseases for whom the individual may experience no symptoms of an observable kind, but is cautioned that these disastrous physical events may be happening despite his or her feelings of good health.
Honestly, I always think of all the radio ads and TV commercials for all the new drugs. I am convinced they find drugs, they say, oh, what does it affect? And then they create like a condition for it. And that's how they do it. Okay. Honestly.
He also mentions, and this is not a direct quote, but he talks about how, you start seeing a commercial. And what does it say? It's December, flu season is here.
Yes.
So you're expected to get the flu now. it's almost kind of, unless you get a flu shot, and I'm not knocking vaccinations.
No,
but I'm just
not at all.
It's a belief system. The quote you're referring to, and this is from The Nature of Personal Reality, the individual is made to feel powerless at the mercy of doctors and nurses who often do not have the time or energy to be personable or to explain his or her condition in terms that he can understand. The patient is therefore forced to transfer his own sense of power to others, which further deepens his misery. This in turn reinforces the sense of powerlessness that initiated his condition. So it becomes a vicious cycle. And I'm a big fan of natural healing, spiritual healing, but I've read a lot of Mary Baker Eddy, who ended up unwillingly founding Christian Science. She didn't write the book to start Christian Science, but she just wrote it as like, well, look what Jesus said, how to heal yourself. But that myth they have about Christian scientists who like let their children die.
Right.
She never said that. What she said was, if you haven't worked out the metaphysics and you're not getting better as a result, go to the doctor and be done with it, and then come back and work on the metaphysics. So doctors are useful. I mean,
absolutely.
I ended up this year getting a partial knee replacement, and I realized on some level it was manifesting my own resistance to change and flexibility. I apparently didn't manage to heal myself quickly enough before I lost my partial knee, but that's the way it goes. I took care of it, and I'm still working on my metaphysics and what I'm resisting and what I'm fighting. So sometimes you have to accept the illness that you have chosen to create for yourself. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get the illness because it's just to prove that you don't have it anymore and to get rid of it and show yourself that you have some sort of power over it. Go ahead.
It's sort of a little bit of a digression, sort of, but I just want to talk about the healing, and you mentioned Jesus, and I actually just want to go to the Bible for 1 second, just because, I grew up, I was raised Roman Catholic, went to catechism. You didn't go to Catholic school, but went to catechism, and still remember, many of those lessons. And as I got older and I started reading, it was Catherine Ponder's work many years ago, and she had this series of books, and it was called The Millionaires of Genesis, is I believe the name of it. And so when you read it and you really look at parts of the Bible and you see how they were millionaires, there was wealth, and because you mentioned the ask and you shall receive, ask and it is given. And if you really look at the Bible and you take away, and I do want to say sort of the dogma of it or some of the teachings, the message is really, we are supposed to be plentiful. And of course, love, right? But we are supposed to have. And a lot of it is what you believe. And they talk about that in the Bible as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's the belief is so important. But we have to recognize what we're believing in.
Right.
I often joke that everybody's a recovering Roman Catholic, and I'm not knocking. Of course, the Bible has truth in it. I don't know how well every religion has manifested the truth of the Bible, but yes, it's something that we have to get past. This whole idea. Well, one of my favorite, the word sin. Mm-hmm. If you go back to the original Hebrew and the original Aramaic, in Hebrew, to sin meant an error in judgment. And if you go back to the original Aramaic, when you sin, the direct translation is missing the point. Mm-hmm. And I always thought, I look at the commandments, and it's like, if you feel you have to steal, you're missing the point. If you feel you have to kill, you're missing the point. Why? Because it's all there in the universe when you need it.
Right.
So why do you have to steal from somebody? Why do you feel the need to kill somebody? So instead of this whole system of checks and balances, 12 sins means 5 years in purgatory and 27 rosaries. Instead, it's a matter, a sin is when you sit there and go, oh, well, that didn't work. What have I missed here? What am I doing wrong? What do I need to fix and correct and grow? You shouldn't, there's no point in beating yourself up. It doesn't mean you shouldn't, make restitution if it's called for, but stop saying I'm a bad person, because then you'll be a bad person.
Labeling.
Yes.
And I'm going to go to this, not again, in the school system. I'm just going to say, and this is not, of course, across the board, but you can have a child, they get labeled. And if a child, they're labeled ADD, ADHD, or anything, or there's a problem, it just spreads. It follows them. It can follow them from grade to grade. The records go to the next school. And, that's why I remember when I was much younger I used to read articles, my great reading material, the TV Guide. and I would read interviews, with these actresses and actors. And at a young age, I noticed this theme of how many of them left home. And not just because they came to California or to New York, but even if they lived in California or New York, they just went out on their own young. And it really made an impression on me because I thought, yeah, they left home and they also left all of the judgments, all of their history. And that makes a huge difference because they didn't have that. And one of the things Seth says also makes a point of is he's not saying that like unfavorable circumstances, like that I'm saying bad things don't happen, but it's, you shouldn't pretend. I think that's what the quote was. He says you shouldn't pretend that unfavorable circumstances do not sometimes, happen or exist. Right. But he does say you have to remember that good events, they happen as often or far more than the negative ones do.
Oh, I have a great quote to expand that.
Go for it.
The book, The Way Toward Health. Remind yourself constantly that the most favorable solution to a problem is at least as probable as the most unfortunate solution. Remind yourselves that also, and despite all of your worrying, the spirit of life itself is continually within your experience and forms your physical body. And so many of us is like, oh my God, this is going to get terrible. It's like, well, what about this could get great?
Yeah.
What about that sense of optimism and faith? Like I said earlier, have faith. There is a solution. You may not know it right now, but there is a solution. I have a story from my own life. I was in Brooklyn. God, this goes back 30 some odd years. And I was helping out some charitable organizations, showing them how to do graphics and stuff. And I left the place, and it's late at night, and I'm walking up this street to the subway. And as I'm walking up the street, this gentleman comes towards me, and as he walks by me, he says very quietly out of the side of his mouth, "Watch your back." And I'm like, okay. And I perceive that on the other side of the street, there are 4 teenagers going up the street sort of bent over commando style behind the cars. And I know I'm being sized up.
Right.
And my first thought was, oh hell, damnation. But the difference is I didn't sit there and say, oh my God, I'm going to be mugged. What I started thinking was, how do I get out of this? How do I get out of this? How do I get out of this? There's got to be a way. How do I get out of this? Mm-hmm. And what I ended up doing is I walked into the middle of the street and started walking down the white line in the middle of the street. And there was enough traffic, not a lot, but enough that, I was kind of safe there, so to speak. And
safer than on the other side of the street.
Right. And one of the kids caught up with me, and they called out to me, and they were like, yo, man, I want to ask you a question. I said, go ahead. He goes, well, come over here. And I said, I can hear you fine from where I am. And they just were like, the heck with it. They walked away, and I got to the train station. My heart was pounding in my chest. And I'm not pretending I'm some magical, clever person. The only difference here is that I didn't say, oh, my God, I'm going to get mugged. I said, how do I get out of this? What's the solution? And that's the same thing I said earlier. You have to maintain the faith that there is a solution and you just haven't figured it out yet. And the universe leans in your direction. I asked the universe, not maybe consciously. Consciously, my adrenaline was so high I couldn't ask anybody anything. But there was definitely a message sent. How do I get out of this? The universe said, oh, you want to get out of this? Okay. And sent me the whatever sent into my brain the thing, walk in the middle of the street, and I did. So that's the optimism, and that's the same belief when I just read in that quote. It's like it's just the favorable solution is just as probable as the unfavorable solution. It's just up to you to choose which one, And
before we wrap this up, what I want to talk about, and I just think it's such a great note to. I'm going to sort of say to bring it together. And it's from the early sessions, volume 7, and it's session 332. It was actually April 5th of 1967. And Seth talks about helping others.
One of my favorites. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's the quote. I'd like you to give that quote, and I'd like to talk about that because I just think that is one of the most powerful quotes, and certainly one of the most, I don't say truthful ones or meaningful ones.
Ones that resonate, certainly.
Yes.
It says, when you help others in your own way, you help and reinforce the self. You develop your own abilities, and in closing off from others, you close yourself. You both seem to fear that all your time will be consumed, or that you will be at the mercy of others if you choose to give in at all. This alternate exists only in your own minds, for others will show both gratitude and consideration, and your abilities will deepen and mature, and the gift of empathy be heightened.
Yeah.
And we're all so afraid of each other. Oh my God, I'm going to owe them something. Oh my God, they're going to suck the life out of me. No, not true. If you give with love and playfulness, it always comes back to you.
And it may not come back from that same person. That's sometimes what people sort of miss that point. The person that you help, you help them. It's not quid pro quo, like, okay, they're going to come and do something. But at some point in your life, someone steps up and does something for you.
Yes. And well, that's the old cliche they talk now, pay it forward.
Right.
You do a favor for somebody, what do I owe you? And you pay it forward. You'll find somebody down the road who needs a hand, give it to them. And when you do it, you can think, oh, well, Tony did this for me, so I'm going to do this for this other person. Yeah, it's we're here to look. Even Vonnegut, one of my favorite.
Oh, Kurt Vonnegut, yes.
One of my favorite Vonnegut quotes is, "We're here to help each other through whatever this thing is."
Yes.
It's just to cut right to the chase. We're here to help each other with whatever this thing is.
That's right.
And then I think that's a big part of Seth. It's like we're here to manifest our individuality, and we're also here to recognize that we're all connected at the same time, which certainly fits with the theme of the Age of Aquarius, which we've been kicking off in the past century or so. And I don't think it's the dawn of the Age of Aquarius. I think we're like knee-deep in Aquarius already. And it's going to go on for 2,000 years, so we better start helping each other and working together.
And get it together, right? And get it together.
Absolutely.
This has been wonderful. And again, for just everyone who's listening, if you're not familiar with Seth, go online, buy a book, really, and read the material. Are you planning to do any lectures coming up perhaps on Seth?
Not at the moment. I'm actually proposing one for out on Long Island at the Eyes of Learning, but I haven't. That'd be like 6 months down the road, maybe, if I get an option for it. I will suggest, if you're going to start with Seth, and you don't know much about it, Seth Speaks is the first book, and it's probably the most introductory in its nature because he's kind of explaining who he is and what's going on, and that's a good starting point if you like to begin at the beginning. If that's the way you roll. If that's the way you roll.
And and by the way, you can follow Anthony on Twitter, and it's at AS Picco. That's Picco. And again, I'm going to have all these links there for you. Facebook.com/Anthony.Picco.3. And again, that meetup.com/NYC-astrology. If you're in the New York or the metro area, sign up. They have really very, very interesting lectures. You get to go. You can meet Anthony in person, shake his hand.
If that's what you want to do, sure.
If that's what you want to do. Well, I hope you get out here at the Eyes of Learning, because I certainly would love to come and hear the lecture.
Yeah, actually, I did a couple of Seth lectures back there in 2010 and 2011. So I've done them before out there. It's just a matter of getting back out there again and doing another one.
It seems like it's time. I mean, that's been a number of years. So
it sure has been, yeah.
Right? It's about time for another one. So, Anthony, I want to thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
And everyone, check out Cosmic Tuesdays, by the way, because really very interesting shows. There's archives they can listen to as well. And, until next week, I'm Deborah Ann Clement, and may Jupiter's blessings be your constant companion.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. To schedule a consultation, please visit DeborahClementAstrologer.com.